May 18, 1980. It's 8:32 on a Sunday morning in southwest Washington. On the north face of Mount St. Helens, a slab of rock over a mile wide breaks loose and slides away. Mountains are not supposed to do that. 6 miles north, on a ridge the scientists had called safe, a 30-year-old geologist named David Johnston keys his radio. He gets 5 words out. Vancouver, Vancouver, this is it. What follows is a wall of rock and gas, 600 degrees, racing flat across the ground at nearly the speed of sound. It bursts from the mountain's open side and flattens everything in its path. People who saw it said it looked like the start of World War II. 6 miles was not far enough. 57 people will die this morning. Almost all of them were standing exactly where they had been told it was safe to stand. This is the story of the deadliest eruption in modern American history.
Mount St. Helens had been quiet for 123 years. Then in March of 1980 it woke up. On March 20th a magnitude 4.0 earthquake shook the peak, the first sign that magma was moving underneath it. A week later the summit cracked open a new crater and began venting steam. Through April, earthquakes came by the dozens every single day, and helicopters full of geologists, reporters, and sightseers circled a mountain that had suddenly become the most closely watched volcano on Earth. Then the north face started to move. Survey crews had noticed a bulge growing on the mountain's flank, and by spring it was unmistakable, a dome of rock more than a mile across, being pushed outward by magma rising inside the peak. It grew 5 to 6 feet every day. By the middle of May it stood more than 400 feet out of line with the rest of the mountain. One of the scientists monitoring it, that same 30-year-old volcanologist David Johnston, compared the mountain to a keg of dynamite with the fuse already lit. Washington State drew a restricted zone around the volcano and closed it off. Johnston's data and his insistence on caution helped keep that zone closed against loud and growing pressure from cabin owners and a timber industry that wanted back in. By mid-May that standoff had been running for weeks. Scientists were warning that the north face could fail at any hour. But the public had watched the mountain steam and rumble for 2 months without anything worse happening, and the fear was wearing off. On May 17 officials relented just far enough to escort one convoy of property owners in to collect their belongings. A second convoy was scheduled for 10 the next morning. "We're paying taxes," one resident said, "and we'd like to use our property." "I'm not afraid." The mountain went at 8:32.
At 6 that Sunday morning David Johnston had radioed in his measurements from Coldwater 2, an observation post on a ridge 6 miles north of the summit. Nothing unusual, he reported. The bulge was creeping outward at the same steady rate it had held for weeks. The sky over the mountain was clear. He'd taken that shift only 13 hours earlier, covering for a colleague who was needed elsewhere. 6 miles felt like distance. 6 miles was the edge of what volcanology in 1980 believed a mountain like this could reach. At 8:32 a.m. magnitude 5.1 earthquake fired directly beneath the north flank. For a few seconds the mountain held. Then the entire bulging face, 3/4 of a cubic mile of rock and glacier ice, sheared loose and slid towards Spirit Lake. It remains the largest landslide ever recorded on land. And that sliding mountainside was also a cork coming out of a bottle. The magma inside the peak had been held down by the sheer weight of the mountainside sitting on top of it. With that weight suddenly gone, the gas locked inside the molten rock flashed free all at once, and the volcano detonated through the open wound in its side. The blast fired north, horizontally, straight over the top of the landslide that had just freed it. It left the mountain at roughly 220 miles an hour and accelerated to nearly 670, approaching the speed of sound. The cloud behind it was 660 degrees Fahrenheit. It overtook the fastest thing in the valley, the landslide itself, and then it started catching everything else. There was no siren for something like this, and there would have been no point, because the cloud was moving at nearly the speed of sound across much of the valley. It arrived with its own thunder still trailing somewhere behind it. At Coldwater 2, 6 miles out, the blast was seconds from the ridge where David Johnston stood. His warning was already on its way to Vancouver, the last anyone would ever hear from him. The blast crossed that ridge in about a minute. What the blast did to the land north of the mountain had no precedent anywhere in the United States. Closest to the volcano, the forest simply ceased to exist. 100-foot Douglas firs were torn whole out of the ground and carried away. Further out, to a distance of 17 miles, the trees snapped at the base and fell in combed rows, millions of them, all pointing away from the mountain like iron filings around a magnet. When it was over, 230 square miles of forest lay flat. Pilots flying over the ridges that afternoon described whole valleys that looked like they'd been swept with a broom. Then the vertical eruption began. With its side torn open, the volcano drove a column of ash boiling into the sky, 80,000 feet in under 15 minutes, and held it there for more than 9 hours. The plume rolled east across Washington. Survivors who made it out described a darkness with no comparison. "I just can't describe it," one said. "It's pitch black. Just pitch black. This is hell on earth I'm walking through." In Yakima, 90 miles away, streetlights came on at mid-morning. In Spokane, visibility dropped to 10 feet in the middle of the day. Ash fell across 11 states, and the finest of it circled the entire planet within 15 days. The mountain still wasn't finished. Its glaciers, the ice that had capped the peak for centuries, melted into the eruption, and that meltwater mixed with loose rock into lahars, volcanic mudflows with the consistency of wet concrete. They poured down the river valleys west of the mountain, swallowing bridges and homes as they went. 90 minutes after the eruption, a wall of mud 12 feet high was moving down those valleys, 27 miles from the mountain. By 1 in the afternoon, it was pushing past Castle Rock on the Cowlitz River, more than 40 miles out, a river running the wrong color and the wrong texture, gray and thick, carrying whole log decks and the wreckage of houses. The mud rode all the way to the Columbia, the Pacific Northwest's main shipping channel, and choked it closed to ocean freighters. Geologists later put the energy released that morning at 24 megatons of TNT. The summit of Mount St. Helens, the top 1,300 feet of one of the most photographed peaks in America, was simply gone. A mountain that stood 9,677 feet tall at breakfast measured 8,363 by the time the ash cleared enough to see it. Nearly all of that violence landed on ground the official maps had called safe. The blast zone that morning held loggers, campers, scientists, and photographers. 57 of them did not come out. Robert Landsberg was a 48-year-old photographer who had spent weeks documenting the volcano's slow-motion threat. On the morning of May 18th, he was parked a few miles west of the summit with his camera when the north face collapsed. He did what he'd come to do. He shot frame after frame as the cloud boiled outward and filled more and more of his viewfinder. Somewhere in those final frames, the picture stopped being a photograph of an eruption and became a photograph of the thing that was about to reach him. Landsberg understood this. He spent his last minute on the film instead of on himself. He rewound the roll back into its canister, sealed the camera in his bag, and lay down on top of the pack, shielding it with his body. Searchers found him 17 days later, under the ash. The film survived, and it developed. The frames Robert Landsberg protected, a wall of ash swallowing the sky, remain among the only close-range images of the lateral blast ever taken. Geologists still study them today. Reed Blackburn, a 27-year-old newspaper photographer manning a camera post for National Geographic and the U.S. Geological Survey, was caught at Coldwater Eye, 8 miles from the summit. His camera was recovered too. The film inside it was ruined. On the shore of Spirit Lake, the eruption took Harry Truman, an 83-year-old lodge owner who had lived on that shoreline for 52 years and who had spent the spring telling every reporter in America that the mountain would never hurt him. He stayed with his 16 cats. The lodge, the shoreline, and the man were buried under 150 feet of debris. Of the 57 people who died on May 18th, Truman was the only one inside the restricted zone without permission. David Johnston's body was never found. 13 years later, a road crew cutting through the debris turned up pieces of his USGS trailer. The ridge where Coldwater 2 once stood carries his name now, Johnston Ridge. His colleagues have lived with the arithmetic ever since. The man whose warnings had helped keep the public off the mountain was one of the people it killed, 6 miles from the summit. 57 dead, most of them asphyxiated by the ash cloud. More than $1 billion in damage, over $3.5 billion in today's money. 230 square miles of forest flattened in minutes. And a set of official maps that had to answer for all of it. Because here is the uncomfortable arithmetic of May 18th. Nearly all of the dead were outside the restricted zone, on roads, ridges, and campsites the state had left open. Journalists and historians who later reconstructed the decision-making found that the zone had been drawn tight around the summit less by science than by politics. Much of the land in the blast path belonged to a timber company, and closing it was a fight no one in the state government wanted. An order extending the zone was sitting on Governor Dixie Lee Ray's desk, and signed, on the morning the mountain erupted. "It seemed to me that was a quite reasonable thing to do," she said afterward, "and far better than simply closing the area and saying all those people could no longer earn a living. The only reason the death toll stopped at 57 is the calendar. It was a Sunday. On any working day, hundreds of loggers would have been cutting timber inside the blast area, with permission. What changed afterward changed for good. 2 years after the eruption, the U.S. Geological Survey opened a permanent volcano observatory in Vancouver, Washington, the Cascades Volcano Observatory, dedicated to David Johnston. The United States built a standing volcano alert system modeled on the National Weather Service's storm warnings, and Mount St. Helens became the most closely monitored volcano in the Cascades. Scientists who study lateral blasts today still work, in large part, with data that came off this mountain, including the frames from a roll of film that one photographer chose to protect instead of himself. In 1980, the maps drew a circle around the summit of Mount St. Helens and called everything outside it safe. The mountain exploded sideways.